Maria had built her entire career on one certainty. Oliver had been driving that night. The police report said so. Her father said so. The whole town said so. Then she came home for the first time in 15 years and found him still there, quietly collecting evidence against the man who had destroyed them both. Maria had built her entire career on control, and in Chicago that meant everything. Every word in court was measured, every document precise, every pause intentional. She had learned that early, long before her name started carrying weight in courtrooms. She had turned pressure into discipline, a tool she used to bury the memories of the coast. Memories that had always felt like a blurred, unfinished sentence. The concussion she had sustained that night had left a convenient void where the impact should have been, a blank space that her father and the local doctors had filled with a gentle, consistent lie while she was still too broken to contest it. For 15 years, she had accepted the official narrative of the accident as a closed chapter, a trauma she had simply locked away to ensure her survival in Chicago. But standing here now, the gaps in that memory felt less like a personal failing and more like a tactical omission. She hadn't just forgotten. She had been encouraged to stop looking. Behind Oliver, footsteps approached, slower and heavier. Her father appeared in the doorway, pausing when he saw her. There was no dramatic reaction, no overwhelming emotion, just a quiet recognition that carried more weight than words. He looked older than she remembered, not dramatically so, but in the subtle ways time accumulates when no one is measuring it closely. "Maria," he said simply, as if the name itself was enough to confirm reality. She stepped forward and hugged him, the familiar scent of cedar and sea salt breaking through her professional armor for a fleeting second. She held on longer than she usually allowed herself, feeling the tremor in his hands before she eventually stepped back, her eyes briefly damp as she forced herself to recalibrate. It was a lapse she hadn't budgeted for, a crack in the precision she had spent 15 years perfecting, and it made her realize that being here wouldn't just be an analytical exercise. Her father gestured for her to come inside, but she didn't move right away. Her attention drifted back to Oliver, who had already shifted slightly away, as if consciously maintaining distance without making it obvious. He wasn't leaving, but he also wasn't inviting proximity. "You're helping him with repairs?" she asked, referring to her father without breaking eye contact with Oliver. "Roof needed fixing," Oliver replied. Nothing complicated. The simplicity of his answer felt deliberate, like he preferred reducing things to their most functional form. No elaboration, no unnecessary context, just utility. Maria nodded slightly, but didn't continue the line of conversation. She could feel it already, the tension beneath the surface, not hostile, but unresolved. The kind of tension that doesn't escalate immediately, but also doesn't disappear. Her father stepped back inside, leaving the two of them momentarily in the threshold space between outside and inside, past and present. The wind moved lightly across the porch, carrying the sound of distant waves that never seemed to get closer or farther away. Oliver finally broke the silence again. "You staying at the house?" "I assume I still can," she replied. A pause. "You always assume things still work the same way they used to," he said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. That landed differently than it should have, because it wasn't about logistics. It was about her. Maria didn't respond immediately. Instead, she observed him again, more carefully this time, trying to place the version of him she remembered against the one standing in front of her now. There was a distance in him that hadn't been there before, not emotional chaos, but emotional closure. Like something had already been decided long ago, and nothing here would reopen it. "I'm not here for arguments," she said finally. "I didn't think you were," Oliver replied. That should have ended it, but it didn't, because neither of them moved. The silence stretched between them again, not uncomfortable, but loaded, the kind of silence that carries history inside it without explaining any of it. Then Oliver stepped slightly back, releasing the doorway. "I've got work to finish," he said. "Roof won't fix itself." And with that, he turned away, leaving Maria standing on the porch with the realization that this place hadn't just stayed the same physically. It had preserved every unresolved thing she had once tried to leave behind, waiting for her return without any intention of making it easy. Maria didn't unpack immediately. The house felt less like a refuge and more like a paused moment she had stepped back into without permission, as if time had simply been waiting for her to return so it could continue from where it left off. Her father moved around the kitchen with quiet familiarity, offering no pressure, no questions, just the kind of silence that assumed she would speak when she was ready. Oliver, however, remained a different kind of presence entirely, not intrusive, not distant in an obvious way, but consistently just outside the edges of interaction, like someone who had learned long ago not to take up unnecessary space. Her father would sometimes pause in the doorway, watching her sift through folders with a heavy, unreadable expression. "You're looking for logic where there was only fear, Maria," he said quietly one evening. "We didn't just sign those papers to save the town. We signed them to save you from a courtroom that would have ended your future before it began. We bought your career in Chicago with a 15-year silence, but the interest on that debt is finally due. We signed them because he was the only one promising that tomorrow would look like today. We bought peace with silence, and Oliver paid the highest price for that peace." That evening, while going through old storage boxes in the study, Maria began to notice something she hadn't expected. Documents, property records, legal notices, all carefully preserved but partially updated. At first it looked like routine maintenance of family affairs, nothing unusual for a small coastal town where land ownership carried generations of quiet disputes. But then she saw the pattern. Repeated valuations of coastal property, infrastructure planning drafts, municipal references that didn't belong in private files. And then one name appeared more than once. Cartwright. Mayor Harold Cartwright. The name wasn't unfamiliar, even from Chicago. She had seen similar profiles before, local politicians with aggressive development agendas, leveraging bureaucratic pressure to reshape property ownership under the guise of economic improvement. But here, in Blackwood Bay, it wasn't abstract. It was targeted. She closed the folder slowly and exhaled once, controlled. This wasn't coincidence. It was direction. The next morning, she went into town under the pretense of getting basic supplies, but her actual intention was observation. Blackwood Bay's center hadn't changed much. A small cluster of shops, a dock stretching into the water, a municipal building that looked older than its authority. But beneath the surface familiarity, she began noticing signs that didn't belong to a quiet town. Survey markers near the shoreline, temporary fencing that wasn't explained anywhere publicly, workers who avoided direct questions, and most importantly, people who avoided talking about certain areas entirely. By midday, she had enough fragments to understand the outline of what was happening. The coastline, particularly the stretch of land bordering Oliver's property, was being quietly evaluated for redevelopment. Officially, it was framed as a revitalization initiative aimed at increasing tourism and private investment. Unofficially, it looked like a controlled acquisition strategy disguised as civic improvement. When she returned to the house that afternoon, Oliver was outside, working near the side of the building. He didn't look up immediately when she approached, but he clearly noticed her presence. "You've been asking questions," he said without greeting. It wasn't a question. Maria stopped a few steps away. "You've been watching me?" "I live here," he replied. "People talk." That was true, and she knew it. In places like this, silence still carried information. "I saw the property markers near the coast," she said. Oliver finally straightened, turning slightly toward her. There was no surprise in his expression, only a controlled acceptance, like he had been expecting this conversation at some point, just not this early. "They've been expanding surveys for months," he said. "Cartwright calls it development. Most people here call it pressure." Maria processed that without interrupting. "And your land is part of it." A pause. "Yes." No hesitation. No elaboration. Just confirmation. That simplicity told her more than a detailed explanation would have. He wasn't guessing. He had already been through the stages of denial and acceptance. "They're trying to take it," she said. "They're trying to reclassify it," Oliver corrected. "Tax restructuring, zoning adjustments, legal pressure. It's cleaner than outright theft. Harder to fight." Maria looked toward the coastline in the distance. From here, it looked calm, almost indifferent. But she knew how systems like this worked. They didn't need force when paperwork could do the same job. "And you've done nothing?" she asked. That finally shifted something in his expression, not anger, but restraint tightening. "I've done what I can," he said. "But this isn't something you win by arguing with forms." Maria turned back to him. "That depends on who is writing the forms." There was a brief silence between them again, But this time it carried something different, not history, but alignment. For the first time since her arrival, Oliver studied her directly, not as someone from the past, but as someone reacting in the present. "You think you can fix this?" he asked. "I think I can understand it," she replied. And that's usually where control starts. He gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod, but didn't accept or reject the idea. From inside the house, her father called her name briefly, but neither of them moved yet. The conversation outside had shifted something structural between them. Not trust, not alliance, but recognition that whatever was happening in Blackwood Bay was no longer separate from her reason for being there. And for the first time, Maria understood that her return wasn't just personal. It was becoming procedural. Maria didn't sleep much that night. The house was quiet in the way old places are quiet. Not empty, but filled with layers of sound that no longer happen. Footsteps that used to exist, conversations that stopped mid-sentence years ago, the faint memory of a life that had moved on without fully leaving. She stayed in the small guest room she once used as a teenager, sitting at the edge of the bed with printed documents spread across her lap, reading the same lines repeatedly until they stopped feeling like words and started feeling like structure. Cartwright's name kept returning, not in one document, not in one system, but across multiple layers of administration, zoning proposals, tax reassessments, shoreline development permissions. It wasn't random pressure. It was coordinated legal escalation, the kind she had seen before in corporate takeovers disguised as public projects. The only difference was the scale. Here, the target wasn't a company. It was land that couldn't defend itself, and Oliver was standing directly in its path. The next morning, she found him already outside again, as if he never fully left the physical space of work. The air was colder, the sky heavier, and the town below them felt slower than usual, like it was waiting for something to happen but refusing to acknowledge it. "You didn't sleep," he said without looking up. "It's not necessary for analysis," she replied. That earned a short glance from him. Not surprise, just confirmation of something he had probably already assumed about her. Maria stepped closer, stopping a few feet away, holding a folder in her hand. "I went through everything I could find," she said. "Your tax records, the municipal filings, the zoning applications." "You went through my private records," he said, not accusing, just noting. "I went through publicly accessible filings," she corrected. "And anything your father kept organized in a way that assumes someone might eventually need to defend it." That made him pause for a second longer than before. And Maria opened the folder and placed it on the table beside him. "They're building a legal framework around your property," she said. "Not one document, not one action. A sequence. If nothing interrupts it, it will look legitimate by the time it reaches enforcement stage." Oliver finally stopped what he was doing. "That's how they always do it." "Yes," Maria said, "but it doesn't mean it's unbreakable." He straightened slowly, looking at her more directly now. "You're talking like this is a case." "It is a case," she replied. That statement changed the air between them slightly. Not dramatically, but enough to mark a shift in how she was being perceived. Not as someone visiting, not as someone passing through, but as someone structuring reality into something actionable. Oliver folded his arms. "And what exactly are you planning to do? Argue with a mayor in a town where you're not even local anymore?" "I don't need to be local," she said. "I need documentation. And leverage." A faint silence followed. Then he gave a short, almost humorless exhale. "You really haven't changed." Maria didn't react immediately. "I've changed enough to know when something is being engineered." That landed more seriously than either of them acknowledged. A few seconds passed before Oliver finally spoke again, slower this time. "If you get involved in this, it won't stay clean," he said. "Cartwright doesn't play fair." "Neither do systems built on manipulation," Maria replied. That was the first moment where something between them stopped being purely confrontational. Not trust, not agreement, but recognition of shared direction. Oliver looked toward the coastline, then back at her. "You're doing this because of the land," he said. "Or because you think you can fix whatever brought you back here?" Maria didn't answer immediately. The truth was more complicated than either option, and she didn't allow herself to simplify it just to make it easier to say. "Both," she said finally. That was honest enough. Oliver nodded once, slowly, as if accepting something he had resisted naming until now. "Then you're going to need access to everything they've already done," he said. "I already started collecting it," Maria replied. A pause. And I can get the rest, he added. That was the moment the structure between them changed. Not friendship, not reconciliation, but alignment under necessity. Maria looked at him carefully. You're offering help. I'm offering reality, Oliver said. If you're right, this isn't something either of us handles alone. The wind moved across the yard, cutting through the space between them, but neither of them moved away from it. For the first time since arriving in Blackwood Bay, Maria wasn't operating alone inside her own logic. And Oliver, who had spent years isolating himself from external systems, was stepping back into one. Not because he trusted her, but because the alternative was losing something he still wasn't ready to let go of. By the third day in Blackwood Bay, Maria could feel that the town had started to treat her differently, and it wasn't a single obvious event that caused it, but a gradual accumulation of small behavioral shifts that only someone trained in reading systems would notice. Conversations in public spaces stopped the moment she entered the same area, not abruptly, but naturally, as if they had already been about to end. People who had previously made polite eye contact now avoided it entirely or looked through her rather than at her. And even routine interactions in shops or near the dock carried a subtle hesitation, like every exchange was being filtered through an unspoken instruction not to engage too deeply. Maria didn't react outwardly to any of it, because reacting would only confirm participation in the dynamic. But internally, she was already mapping the pattern, and the pattern was consistent enough to be intentional. Oliver noticed it as well, although he didn't immediately comment on it. Instead, his behavior became more restrained, less open in physical space, as if he was unconsciously minimizing exposure rather than confronting it directly. There was a history in the way he moved through the town that she didn't yet fully understand, but she could see enough to know that this kind of social pressure wasn't new to him. It was familiar. The confirmation of what was happening came when Maria went into the municipal building alone under the pretext of reviewing public records. The structure of the building itself was unremarkable, deliberately so, with narrow corridors and aging interior design that made official processes feel routine rather than powerful. She requested documents related to shoreline zoning and tax reassessment filings, and while the clerk complied without resistance, there was a measurable delay between request and action that suggested awareness rather than ignorance. That delay mattered more than the documents themselves. What she received was technically correct on the surface. Properly formatted zoning adjustments, legally structured tax modifications, and development proposals framed under the language of public benefit. But when examined together, they formed a coordinated sequence rather than isolated decisions. Each document reinforced the next, creating a chain of justification that appeared organic but functioned like construction. This wasn't random bureaucracy, it was controlled progression. Someone had ensured that every step would appear independently valid, while collectively producing a single outcome. Cartwright's influence was present in every layer, not necessarily as a direct signature, but as a guiding structure. Maria had seen similar strategies before in corporate law environments. Incremental normalization of intent, where no single action was illegal enough to challenge, but the combined trajectory became irreversible once it reached a certain point. That was the danger here. Not illegality in isolation, but legality used as architecture. When she left the building, she already understood that her presence in Blackwood Bay had moved beyond being a personal return. It was now an active variable in a controlled environment, and that meant she had already been placed into the system she was trying to observe. Oliver was waiting for her outside the house, his hands resting on a heavy piece of salvaged timber. He looked at her not as a stranger from the city, but as someone who finally saw the same rot he'd been smelling for years. You went to the municipal office, he said, but the usual edge in his voice was replaced by a rough sort of kinship. I tried that 3 years ago. They didn't even give me the forms. They just told me my property tax was being reevaluated the next morning. Maria stopped, looking at the timber in his hands, then at him. They used the administrative process as a weapon because they knew you didn't have the shield of a legal defense. I didn't, Oliver admitted, his grip tightening. I had the evidence. I've been sitting on those logs for years, but in this town, evidence without a witness is just a target on your back. I didn't have the standing to make anyone look at it. I just had a hammer and enough stubbornness to wait for someone the system couldn't ignore. He's been using the town's debt to buy people's silence. You don't just need to be right. You need to be louder than their fear. Maria processed that without interruption. It aligned too well with what she had already observed. And Cartwright controls that process, she said. Not completely, Oliver replied. But he understands how to trigger it. A pause followed, longer than before, because both of them were now acknowledging the same structure from different positions inside it. Maria turned slightly toward the coastline, where survey markers and distant development activity were barely visible, but still present if you knew where to look. He's building momentum, she said. Oliver nodded once. And once momentum stabilizes, it doesn't need him to maintain it anymore. That was the critical point. Maria understood it immediately. The danger was no longer just Cartwright as an individual actor, but the system he had already set in motion, one that could continue functioning even if he stepped back. Later that night, inside the house, they reviewed the collected documents together for the first time without separating their roles. Maria organized the legal structure, identifying inconsistencies, procedural weaknesses, and points where escalation could be legally challenged. Oliver provided context, names, timelines, informal conversations he had overheard over months, small details that never made it into official records but shaped how decisions were actually made in practice. For the first time, their collaboration wasn't theoretical. It was functional. At some point during the review, Oliver leaned back slightly and said, "If you push this too early, they'll isolate you completely." Maria didn't look up from the documents. "They're already trying." "Yes," he said, "but not fully. Not yet." That distinction mattered. Maria finally closed one of the folders. "Then we don't give them time to finish organizing the narrative." Oliver studied her for a moment. "You're thinking like this is a legal case." "It is," she replied. A brief silence. "No," Oliver said quietly. "It's already bigger than that." Maria looked at him then, fully aware of what he was implying. And for the first time since returning to Blackwood Bay, she didn't immediately correct him. Maria started with the archives because archives never lied outright. They simply told the truth in fragments, and fragments were enough if you knew how to connect them. The town's records office was smaller than she expected, more personal than institutional, as if it had been built for people who already knew what they were looking for rather than outsiders trying to reconstruct reality from paper. Oliver didn't come inside with her. He stayed outside, leaning against the building wall, not out of disinterest, but out of habit, like certain spaces still felt unsafe even when nothing obvious was happening inside them. Inside, Maria requested accident reports from 15 years ago. She expected resistance, but the clerk's hesitation was more than bureaucratic. It was the practiced caution of someone guarding a narrative. When the file was finally produced, it was a masterpiece of selective preservation. Maria opened it, her eyes tracking the sequence of witness statements and emergency logs, looking for the gaps she knew had to exist. The reports detailed a vehicle loss of control near the coastal road, but the timing was impossible, and the redactions followed a pattern designed to obscure presence rather than protect privacy. Then she saw her name, buried not in the charges, but in the footnotes of a suppressed supplemental report. She hadn't just forgotten the details. She had been systematically gaslit by the official record into believing she was never behind the wheel. Outside the building, Oliver shifted slightly when she finally stepped out, recognizing immediately from her expression that she had found something. "You saw it," he said. Maria didn't answer right away. "I was there," she said finally. "I was driving. But the records, they were modified to make sure I never remembered it that way. I was gaslit by the very system I'm trained to trust." Oliver didn't react immediately, which meant he already knew she would reach that conclusion eventually. Maria continued, "I was driving, and you took the blame." She felt the coldness of the paper in her hands seep into her skin. Her entire world, built on precision and verifiable facts, shuddered for a fleeting second. This hadn't just been a lapse in memory. It was a systematic amputation of her identity that she had subconsciously accepted to survive Chicago. Oliver didn't deny it. Instead, he looked away briefly toward the coastline, like the memory itself was anchored somewhere out there rather than inside the present. "It wasn't about blame," he said. Maria's voice tightened slightly. "It was about truth." "No," Oliver replied quietly. "It was about what truth would do to you if it stayed intact." That sentence created a silence neither of them immediately filled. Maria closed the file folder, slower now. "You removed me from accountability." "I protected you," he corrected. and destroyed your own life in the process, she said. That was the first time emotion entered her voice since she returned. Not breaking, but sharpening. Oliver finally looked at her directly again. I stayed, he said simply. That statement carried more weight than explanation. Because staying here, in Blackwood Bay, while she left for Chicago meant something he didn't need to elaborate on. Reputation collapsed locally. Opportunities closed. Social structure reoriented around him as a cautionary example rather than a participant. Maria processed that in silence. Then, more quietly than before, she said, "You built your life on my absence." Oliver didn't disagree. That was the most honest answer he had given so far. A long pause followed, and for the first time since arriving, Maria stopped treating the situation purely as a legal structure. Because legal structures didn't usually contain this kind of emotional debt. Later that night, she went through the documents again alone, cross-referencing timelines with what Oliver had said and what the official records implied. The gap between documented truth and lived truth was larger than she initially estimated, and that gap was where manipulation had likely occurred, not in fabrication, but in selective preservation. Someone hadn't just hidden facts. They had curated memory. And that realization shifted her focus away from Cartwright alone. Because Cartwright didn't need to erase the past. He only needed to control how it was interpreted. And in that moment, Maria understood something more dangerous than the legal case itself. This town didn't just have secrets. It had a controlled version of history that everyone had agreed to live inside. The conversation on the cliff above Blackwood Bay didn't start as a confrontation, but it slowly turned into one as both of them stopped pretending that silence could hold everything together. The wind was heavier here, pushing against the edge of the coast with a constant pressure that made it harder to think in straight lines, and the sea below didn't look calm so much as indifferent, repeating the same motion without caring what was being decided above it. Maria had spent most of the day going through the accident file again and again, not because she didn't understand it, but because understanding it too clearly meant accepting that the structure she had believed in for 15 years had been intentionally incomplete from the beginning. Nothing in the official record was outright false in isolation, but the omissions were precise enough to reshape responsibility entirely. Oliver stood slightly to the side when they reached the cliff, not blocking her view, not trying to control the moment, but also not avoiding it. That positioning itself felt intentional, like he had already decided not to influence how she processed what she was about to realize. Maria held the file in her hand even though she no longer needed to read it, because at this point the paper itself was no longer evidence. It was confirmation of a structure she had already reconstructed mentally. She spoke first, because if she didn't, the silence would turn into avoidance again. The accident wasn't just misreported, she said. It was structured. The sequence of documentation, witness statements, and follow-up reports isn't random. It's controlled omission. Someone shaped what would remain in the official version and what would disappear. Oliver didn't respond immediately, which meant he wasn't processing new information. He was acknowledging that she had reached the same conclusion he had already lived with. That gap between discovery and experience created a tension that neither of them rushed to resolve. Maria continued, her voice steady but lower than before. You didn't just take responsibility for what happened. You redirected it entirely. Every official channel, every legal interpretation, every public understanding. It all points away from the actual sequence. A pause followed, heavier than before, because this was no longer about interpretation. It was about intent. Why? She asked finally. Oliver didn't look at her immediately. His gaze stayed on the coastline, as if the answer was easier to hold when not directed at her directly. Because you were leaving, he said. Maria didn't react outwardly, but internally the logic locked into place in a way she didn't like. That doesn't justify rewriting everything, she said. I didn't rewrite it, Oliver replied after a short pause. I chose what would remain stable. That distinction mattered more than he might have realized. It wasn't denial. It was framing. Maria stepped slightly closer, not aggressively, but enough to make the space between them more defined. You made a decision that removed my ability to understand my own past, she said. Yes, he said immediately. No hesitation. No attempt to soften it. That directness created a silence that stretched longer than the previous ones. The wind moved through it, but didn't break it. Maria looked away first, not because she was finished, but because she needed to reorganize the structure of what she was hearing. If I had known, she said finally, I would have made different choices. Oliver's response came quickly, but not emotionally charged. No, he said. You would have made the same choices under different pressure. That statement was not comfort. It was analysis of pattern behavior, and that made it harder to dismiss. They stood there for a moment without speaking, both of them understanding that what had just been exposed wasn't just an event from the past, but the foundation of everything that had happened afterward. The version of her life that led to Chicago, the version of Oliver that remained in Blackwood Bay, even the version of truth that existed between them now, all of it was built on a controlled absence of information. Maria finally spoke again, quieter now. You didn't just protect me from consequences, she said. You contained an entire version of reality. Oliver didn't deny it. Instead, he said, someone had to hold it somewhere. That was the final point of the conversation where justification stopped mattering, because neither of them was arguing about facts anymore. They were confronting the cost of preserving them selectively. When they finally started walking back, the distance between them hadn't disappeared, but it had changed shape. It was no longer built on misunderstanding. It was built on knowledge that couldn't be undone once acknowledged. And for the first time, Maria understood that Blackwood Bay wasn't just the place she had returned to. It was the place where her history had been actively maintained without her consent, long before she ever came back to see it. By the time Cartwright made his first direct move, Maria already understood the structure of the game he was playing, and that understanding changed how she approached everything in Blackwood Bay. Nothing here was random pressure anymore. It was escalation with legal timing. The town wasn't just reacting to her presence. It was being guided into a position where her presence itself became the problem that needed to be solved. It started subtly, exactly the way Oliver had described earlier. First came the inconvenience, then the framing. A notice appeared on the house door one morning, officially polite, structurally cold, requesting verification of occupancy status for municipal tax compliance. Not an accusation, not yet, just documentation. Maria read it once, then twice. Not because she didn't understand it, but because she recognized the pacing. This was not an isolated administrative check. This was the beginning of a sequence. Oliver saw it before she even spoke. They've started formalizing it, he said. Maria didn't look up from the paper. It was already formalized. This is just visibility. That distinction mattered. Visibility meant the system was preparing witnesses. Inside the town, the shift became more visible over the next 2 days. Conversations around her stopped being just avoidance and started becoming alignment. People weren't only withdrawing, they were repositioning. Small comments at the market, indirect remarks near the dock, casual references to outside influence and legal disruption that felt planted rather than organic. Maria didn't respond to any of it, because responding would give it structure, and structure was exactly what Cartwright wanted. Oliver became more active during this phase, but not publicly. He moved through the town in a way that suggested he was collecting reactions rather than participating in them. Every evening, he returned with something tangible. He didn't just bring rumors. He brought a ledger of connections he'd been quietly mapping for months, waiting for a legal mind to bridge the gaps. I couldn't move on this alone, he admitted, spreading a list of shell companies on the table. I knew they were squeezing the coast, but I didn't have the language to make it hurt them. Now I do. He's building consent. Maria looked at the documents without touching them. He doesn't need full consent. He needs procedural majority. Oliver nodded once. Enough people agreeing that resistance looks unreasonable. That was the core mechanism. Maria finally sat down across from him, fully shifting into analysis mode. Then we don't fight the narrative, she said. We break the structure that allows it to stabilize. Oliver studied her for a moment. And how do you plan to do that? She didn't answer immediately, because the answer wasn't simple. Not in execution, at least. We force procedural exposure, she said finally. If the system relies on controlled documentation, we introduce contradiction into the documentation chain. Oliver understood immediately what she meant, even if he didn't fully like it. You're talking about pulling him into court-level visibility, he said. Yes, Maria replied, but not in a way he controls. That was the shift. Because up until now, Cartwright had been operating inside municipal structures where visibility was partial, controlled, and delayed. If Maria could force a scenario where all documents, all claims and all timelines had to be presented simultaneously under legal scrutiny, then the narrative stops being flexible. It becomes testable. Oliver leaned back slightly. That only works if we have access to something he can't sanitize. Maria nodded. Which is why we don't move yet. A pause followed. Then Oliver said, quieter, "You're planning to take this beyond town limits." "I'm planning to take it into a system he can't fully isolate," Maria replied. That meant legal escalation, real escalation, not just local pressure, but formal proceedings that required external review structures. The kind of framework Cartwright couldn't fully control through local influence. Oliver didn't object, but something in his expression shifted slightly. Not fear, not hesitation, awareness of scale. "You came here to get away from collapse in Chicago," he said. "I came here because I was already inside a collapse," Maria corrected. "I just didn't see the source yet." That landed differently. Outside, Blackwood Bay remained quiet, but it no longer felt passive. It felt like something preparing to react. And for the first time, the alliance between Maria and Oliver stopped being reactive and became strategic. Not because trust had fully formed, but because both of them now understood the same thing. Cartwright wasn't defending land. He was defending a system that only worked if no one forced it to fully show itself at once. Here, adaptation was exactly what she wanted to prevent. Instead, she built quietly. Every document Oliver brought in the following days was treated not as information, but as structure. Maria didn't just read them. She reconstructed timelines, cross-referenced inconsistencies, and marked every point where Cartwright's development initiative depended on assumptions rather than enforceable fact. It wasn't enough to show wrongdoing. She needed to show dependency, that his entire project only worked if no one examined all layers of the blueprint at the same time. Oliver watched her process it without interrupting. At first, he assumed she was simply organizing evidence. Then he realized she was building something closer to a legal map, not of what had happened, but of what would collapse if exposed in sequence. One evening, Oliver watched her work in silence before finally setting down a specialized tool he'd been cleaning. "You're not just preparing a case," he said, his voice dropping. "You're building a demolition." Maria didn't look up, but her pen paused. "The project is a house of cards, Oliver. If I pull the middle, the whole thing comes down. And if it falls on us?" he asked. She finally met his gaze, her expression unusually soft. "Then we're already exactly where we need to be, standing outside the wreckage." That single word told him everything he needed. Because this wasn't local resistance anymore. It was structural exposure. The turning point came when Maria identified the weakest layer, funding justification. Cartwright's redevelopment plan relied on projected municipal benefits tied to future zoning approvals. Those projections were not illegal on their own, but they were contingent on occupancy classifications that had been quietly adjusted over time. Adjustments that, once aligned chronologically, created contradiction. "If we expose the chronological chain," Maria said, "the approvals invalidate each other retroactively." Oliver understood the implication immediately. That would stop everything. It would force review, she corrected, which is worse for him than stopping. Review removes control. That was the first time Oliver saw the full scale of what she was building. Not a defense, not a counterattack, a procedural collapse trigger. But it required one thing they still didn't have: direct admissibility, evidence that could survive outside Blackwood Bay's internal structure. That night, Oliver returned later than usual. When he did, he didn't immediately speak. He placed an old, weathered port logbook on the table. "You were looking for a link," he said. "This is the registration for the trucks that moved equipment out of the dock months before it was officially declared unusable. Every plate number traces back to a logistics company owned by Cartwright's brother. I knew where these records were hidden, but I didn't know what the numbers meant until you mapped out the timeline. It turns out I wasn't the only one Cartwright tried to squeeze out of Blackwood Bay. An old contact of mine, someone who used to work in the records office before they were restructured out, has been sitting on this, waiting for someone with the teeth to actually use it." "That doesn't matter," he said finally. But it did matter. Not legally, but personally. Because it confirmed something Maria had already started to suspect. Oliver hadn't just been passive in Blackwood Bay. He had been collecting pressure points long before she returned. She finally picked up the drive. "This is enough to force external review," she said. "Yes," Oliver replied. Another pause. But it also makes you a target, he added. Maria nodded once. We already are targets. The difference is now we can prove why. That shifted the balance completely. Because until now, Cartwright controlled perception. From this point forward, perception would have to survive documentation. The next morning, Maria submitted the initial legal filing, not locally, but through an external channel designed for municipal oversight escalation. It was precise, minimal, and structured to avoid premature rejection. Not an accusation. A procedural inconsistency report with attached supporting chain evidence. Oliver watched her finish it. You're really doing this, he said. Maria closed the laptop. He started it when he assumed nobody would connect all layers at once. A long silence followed. Outside, Blackwood Bay looked the same as always. But inside it, something irreversible had just been initiated. And for the first time, Cartwright's system was no longer operating in isolation. It was under observation. The response didn't come immediately, and that silence was the first sign that Maria's filing had landed where it needed to. In systems like this, absence of reaction wasn't neutrality, it was internal movement. Something was being reviewed, compared, and weighed against itself. Oliver noticed the shift before the official channels did. They're quiet, he said one morning. Maria didn't look up from her notes. That means it's working. She had learned long ago that resistance wasn't measured in confrontation. It was measured in delay. The longer a system took to respond, the more internal contradiction it had to resolve. But Blackwood Bay was not a system used to external scrutiny. By the second day, subtle pressure returned, not from Cartwright directly, but from the town itself. This time it wasn't avoidance. It was questioning. Small, indirect conversations that now carried structured doubt instead of silence. People no longer avoided Maria entirely. They evaluated her presence. She's the lawyer from Chicago, someone said near the dock. Not as information, but as framing. Oliver heard it too. He said nothing, but his posture tightened slightly each time it happened. Then came the official notice. A formal request for clarification regarding submitted allegations of procedural irregularities within municipal development filings. It was carefully written, legally neutral, and structured to force response framing rather than dismissal. Exactly what Maria expected. She read it once and placed it on the table. They're trying to convert it into a local jurisdiction loop, she said. Oliver looked at the document. Meaning they want to keep it inside the system that already benefits from it, Maria replied. If we respond incorrectly, we validate their authority over the process. That was the trap, not denial. Integration. Oliver studied her. And if we don't respond? Then they escalate narrative pressure, Maria said. Public positioning. Reputation framing. They'll try to make the issue social instead of procedural. A pause. That's already starting, Oliver added quietly. Maria didn't disagree. Because it was. That evening, the shift became visible and full. The town meeting board outside the municipal building had been updated. A new agenda item had appeared. Community concerns regarding external legal interference. It wasn't named directly. It didn't need to be. It was a signal. Oliver stopped walking when he saw it. He's preparing the town for alignment, he said. Maria stood beside him, reading it carefully. Cartwright didn't start this recently, he said. The system he's using now, it's built on older decisions. Decisions I was already inside before you came back. Maria didn't interrupt. For the first time, the past wasn't just being revealed, it was expanding. Oliver continued. There are people here who don't just follow him, he said. They remember what happens when they don't. That changed the structure of the situation again. Because now it wasn't just a municipal manipulation case. It was institutional memory enforcement. Maria closed the folder slowly. Then we're not just exposing Cartwright, she said. Oliver nodded once. We're exposing what keeps him in place, he replied. Outside, Blackwood Bay remained quiet. But the silence no longer felt empty. It felt maintained. The escalation came faster than Maria expected, not because Cartwright reacted emotionally, but because he reacted procedurally. Within days of the external filing, Blackwood Bay was no longer just a town under quiet pressure. It became a coordinated legal environment preparing for defense. Notices were issued. Statements were requested. Public narratives were adjusted in real time. And Maria could see the mechanism clearly now. Cartwright mirrored her every move. reframing and reinserting her actions into his own structure to neutralize the threat before it could reach higher authority. Oliver noticed the shift first in the way the town physically reorganized around them. People who previously avoided Maria now acknowledged her presence, but with a new tone, not hostility, but confirmation, as if her role had already been assigned in the story they were being told. That was more dangerous than open resistance, because it meant acceptance of framing. "It's happening," Oliver said one evening, watching the dock from a distance where small groups had started gathering more frequently than before. "He's moved it from pressure to interpretation." Maria didn't look away from the documents spread across the table. "That's the transition phase." Oliver turned toward her. "Transition to what?" "To formal confrontation," she said. "He's forcing procedural alignment, so everything runs through controlled channels." That was exactly what happened the next morning when Maria received the official court notification. Not municipal review, not internal audit. A preliminary hearing had been scheduled. Cartwright had escalated it upward, not to avoid scrutiny, but to control the environment in which scrutiny would happen. Oliver read the notice once and placed it back on the table. "He's bringing it into a courtroom he can influence." Maria nodded slightly. "That's why we don't fight locally anymore." A pause followed. "We move it beyond his reach," she added. Oliver studied her carefully. "And if he's already prepared for that?" Maria finally looked up. "Then we make sure his preparation depends on contradictions he can't resolve." The hearing day arrived faster than either of them spoke about it. The courthouse was not in Blackwood Bay itself, but in the nearest administrative center, a neutral building on paper, though neutrality in systems like this was always conditional. Cartwright was already there when Maria arrived, seated with the calm posture of someone who had never doubted the structure would hold. He didn't look at her immediately. He didn't need to, because the first move wasn't confrontation. It was positioning. The opening statements framed the case as a dispute over municipal procedure and external interference, carefully avoiding language that would expose deeper structural claims. Maria listened without interruption, noting each deliberate omission, each strategic simplification. This wasn't a trial yet. It was narrative conditioning. When it was her turn, she stood and didn't immediately address Cartwright. She addressed the structure. "This case is not about disagreement," she said. "It is about sequence integrity. Every decision presented here depends on prior conditions that have been selectively modified to produce a predetermined outcome." A shift in the room. Cartwright finally looked at her. Maria continued, voice steady. "If those conditions are restored to their original order, the legal foundation of this development collapses under its own dependencies." Cartwright's expression didn't change, but Maria saw it. Not concern, not panic, but recalculation. He was no longer defending the project. He was defending the interpretation of its legitimacy. That was the real battlefield. When the hearing paused, Oliver met her outside the building. "They're adjusting already," he said. Maria nodded. "They have to." "Then what's next?" he asked. She looked back at the courthouse. "Now we force everything into one frame," she said. "No fragments. No controlled sequencing. Full exposure." Oliver understood what that meant. It meant the final confrontation would not be about winning an argument. It would be about whether the system could survive seeing itself all at once. The second hearing wasn't just a continuation of the first one. It was a containment attempt. Maria recognized at the moment she entered the courtroom and saw how the seating had changed, how the documents were prearranged, how even the pacing of the session had been adjusted to reduce friction between arguments. Everything about it was designed to keep the case fragmented, to prevent all elements from being held in the same frame at the same time. Cartwright understood systems. That was clear now. But Maria understood structure collapse. And that was the difference. Oliver sat slightly behind her, not as legal counsel, but as presence, the only person in the room who carried information that hadn't been filtered through institutional framing. He didn't speak unless asked, but his awareness was part of the equation. He was no longer just a witness to the past. He was the silent architect of the present's collapse, providing the technical weight to Maria's legal precision. He knew which parts of Blackwood Bay's history couldn't be found in documents, and which parts of Cartwright's system relied entirely on those missing pieces staying invisible. When Maria stood, the room already felt like it was waiting for her to conform to the structure it had prepared. Instead, she did the opposite. This entire case, she began, has been built on segmented visibility. Each document, each claim, each approval has been evaluated in isolation. That is the intended mechanism. A pause. But systems do not exist in isolation. She placed a new set of compiled records on the table, not separate files, not categorized evidence, but a unified timeline. Oliver had helped reconstruct it. Cartwright's expression shifted for the first time, not visibly dramatic, but precise. The kind of change that happens when someone realizes the architecture they control is being removed from them. Maria continued. When placed in sequence, these actions do not form compliance. They form dependency exploitation. The legality of each step does not survive adjacency to the others. The room reacted subtly, not in agreement or opposition, but in tension, because now everything was being forced into one continuous structure. Cartwright finally spoke. You're interpreting selective alignment as causation. Maria didn't look at him directly when she responded. No, she said. I'm restoring causation that was intentionally separated into isolated legality. That distinction mattered more than anything else in the room, because interpretation could be debated. Sequence could not. Oliver stood up briefly and shifted a single document from the pre-filed evidentiary stack to the center of the table, the financial transfer chain that had been admitted earlier but left unaddressed. It was the missing link connecting municipal approvals to external development interests. It wasn't a dramatic reveal of new evidence, but a strategic highlighting of a fact already in the record. It simply completed the framework. For a moment, the courtroom didn't move. Cartwright looked at it, then at Maria, and for the first time there was something closer to constraint in his posture. Not defeat, not collapse, containment failure recognition. He tried to speak, to appeal to the judge regarding the confidentiality of municipal protocols, but his voice faltered. For a moment, the judge wavered, leaning toward Cartwright's objection that internal municipal strategy was protected from outside discovery. The room held its breath as the entire architecture of Maria's argument teetered on the edge of a procedural dismissal. The mechanism of loyalty built on fear had dissolved the exact second the true cost of his plans became visible. You're trying to destabilize the entire administrative foundation of the town, he said, his voice dropping into a low, jagged threat. You destroy this, Maria, and you destroy the only economy these people have left. Maria didn't blink. Maria pulled out the final piece of the sequence, a service agreement transferring shoreline maintenance rights to a company called Shoreline Assets, where the sole beneficiary through a series of proxies was Cartwright himself. This wasn't a development plan. It was a strategy for artificial municipal insolvency. It would have forced the town to default on fabricated debts, allowing his firm to seize the remaining land for a fraction of its value. The judge leaned forward, the air in the room vanishing as the spectators realized the scale of the theft. Cartwright didn't look at the document. He looked at the exit, his composure finally, irrevocably shattered. Outside, the town was no longer waiting in silence. They were beginning to talk, and for the first time in 15 years, they were using the real names for everything that had been done. It was waiting to see what would remain when silence stopped working. As Maria walked out of the courthouse, she saw her father. He was standing apart from the crowd, not as a witness, but as a man finally dropping a weight that had held his house in stasis for 15 years. He didn't ask about the verdict. He simply nodded, and in that gesture, Maria saw something no document could capture: the permission to finally stop being a part of someone else's structure.